Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. Today we're talking about the Whig Party, and it's spelled W-H-I-G for anybody listening. This, when you kind of look at American history, you might not have heard of it because it's a little bit of a blip on the radar. Dr. Weinberg might disagree, but Dr. Weinberg, can you tell us what was the Whig Party and tell us about its rise and fall?
So the Whig Party, the name calls back to the British political faction, which is effectively the people who are skeptical of consolidated executive power. And that explains their origins. Originally, the Whig Party is more or less nothing more than a protest group against Andrew Jackson. And this creates some odd ideological coalitions. Because on the one hand, you have people like Henry Clay that were part of the old National Republican Coalition that think that Jackson is effectively stopping Congress from doing constitutionally authorized things from their perspective, like the bank and the American system and all that Clay is spooling out. But you also have a faction of them who basically think that Jackson is too sympathetic to federal power. And so this is how you end up. How does John Tyler end up as the Whig vice presidential nominee? It's because he thinks that when Jackson works with Webster, because Jackson's very pro states' rights, but he says nullification is unacceptable. This is something he picks up from Livingston, right? So yes, states' rights, great. States can't enforce this with nullification. So he works with Webster on this. And this causes a few folks like Tyler and some others to say, actually, he's for big government. So I'm going to jump into the Whig Party. So the Whig Party originally is this very ideologically, it's like both sides of the horseshoe kind of against the middle, which is partly why it doesn't end up lasting very long. Because when you're built to be against one thing, when that thing is gone, you're going to resume fighting each other along those lines. But the core of the Whig Party's sort of platform and intellectual leadership are basically Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, who had been part of the old National Republican Coalition. And so effectively, again, they don't want to go all the way back to Hamilton where the feds can tax and spend on whatever they want, but they do think that Congress is authorized to basically subsidize roads. Congress is authorized to build a bank. Congress is authorized to do some kinds of infrastructure. Again, this is easy to overstate the difference between the Whigs and the Democrats. I think it's most accurate to say both of them are factions of the Jeffersonian Democrats. The Federalist view is really wiped out. Clay is very explicit about that. And he criticizes his ideological or his National Republican allies when they flirt with it. So the Whigs are particularly exercised by the thing that gets them the angriest is Jackson vetoing infrastructure and Jackson crushing the bank, not just vetoing its recharter, but also unilaterally removing the deposits on there, which they think is grossly illegal, even some that dislike the bank on the merits. And so to the extent that the Whigs have an ideology, again, it's a little more expansive about federal power than the Democrats are. So after Jackson leaves the scene, the Whigs they get election, they get Harrison elected, but Harrison dies. And Tyler takes over, and the problem is Tyler is basically more Jacksonian than the Jacksonians. That's how he ended up as a Whig. And so they have a bunch of infighting there that makes things a little dicey. And effectively what ends up taking out the Whigs is slavery. The Whigs are internally divided because, again, they're just basically we don't like Andrew Jackson party. And so there are some of them that are pro-slavery. There are some of them that are anti-slavery. But as the slavery issue, and I won't say too much about it because this is its own session, I know, in a few episodes, but effectively as the slavery issue becomes more and more prominent, the Whigs get sort of picked apart, that because they're really hesitant to take a stand on slavery, the pro-slavery Whigs in the South, like Alexander Stephens, realign into being Democrats, once the Democrats end up basically becoming the pro-slavery party. Whereas conversely, the anti-slavery Whigs start spinning out into basically little splinter parties like the Liberty Party. The Free Soil Party is originally basically a Democratic spinoff, but they just start getting picked apart. And they lose the 1852 election, but it looks like it's survivable. But 1854 really does put them away when slavery becomes the issue, and a party that doesn't have anything to say at all on the major issue of the day, it falls apart. So the Whigs are easy but the Whigs, in some cases, parts of their ideology live on to the Republicans, but the Republicans, as we'll talk about in maybe the next one, are a combination of Whigs and Democrats. But the Whigs are effectively the National Republican Party continued on, and with particular skepticism of executive power. Again, so that makes sense why their name is what it was.
Dr. Byenberg, really quick.
So fundamentally, they are a pro-Congress party, right? If we're thinking of Congress versus the presidency, that I would say Congress plus Congress's ability to do some, again, infrastructure spending are the main things that are their ideology. There's other stuff as well, but I would say those are the main things.
Dr. Byenberg, for listeners who don't know what nullification is, can you give us a quick definition of what that is? Because it's also going to come up in our next podcast episode.
Yeah, something that I can carry forth on great length. This was like half of one of my books. Nullification is the idea. It's sometimes blamed on Jefferson. Jefferson sort of makes an allusion to it. They will also pick Madison as a starting point. I don't think that's accurate. I would say nullification really is John Calhoun's project. And it's the idea that the states have unilateral authority to block unconstitutional what they perceive to be unconstitutional federal law. So in the 1830s specifically, South Carolina thinks that the tariff is unconstitutional because it's designed to be effectively economic protection instead of revenue generating. And so they think that's unconstitutional. Again, don't need to get into the merits of that claim. But they effectively pass an ordinance that more or less says they will militarily resist it. And Andrew Jackson, again, he's a states' rights guy, but he says, look, effectively control F nullification. It's not in the Constitution. And this is something where Webster and Livingston, who we talked about in the last episode, more or less write his materials for him. And they say there's no authority by a state to unilaterally, by force, block something the feds are doing. There are all sorts of techniques in the Constitution for states to push back. They can send protest memos. They can change their senators. They can use the Supreme Court, right? So there's a list of things that they can do. But they can't basically say, we get to stay in the Union, but basically veto unilaterally any laws we don't like. As Jackson says, I think he's right on the merits on this. He says, my constitutional obligation is to take care that the laws be faithfully enforced. Does he apply that in every policy in his life? No, he does not. But the nullification claim, I think he's quite right to say you are effectively forcing the president to let any state veto a law, even if it's been passed by Congress as the legitimate authority. So Jackson, effectively backed by Webster and Clay and others, prepares to, and this is in the 1830s, this is really prepares to suppress nullification. So that's one thing where the Democrats and what is turning into the Whigs agree. Nullification becomes very quickly discredited. In fact, amazingly, even the Confederates, when they're seceding, actually will say, we like Andrew Jackson. We think nullification is completely crazy. Secession, their argument, and I don't think it's a totally crazy one. They say, look, secession means we're just done. Like, we're not participating in the Union. Nullification means we get to stay in the Union, but basically pick and choose the parts we like a la carte. And so their argument is you're either in or you're out. So I think there's actually an intellectual clarity to that. But nullification is regarded as pretty crazy. And we'll talk about how that's not used just by the South, but by the North as the slavery scenario gets worse and worse in subsequent sessions.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Byenberg. Listeners, our next episode is going to be on political parties reflecting the growing divisions over slavery. So make sure you join us.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.